Hello, everyone. Welcome. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, the EUDR, Driving a Nature Positive Transition. My name is Helena Leonel Ferreira, and I'll be your host throughout today's session. So just a few words about myself. I coordinate the EMA4U project, one of the co-organizers of today's event. And I'm a project manager for nature strategies at ETIFOR, which is an environmental consultancy and spin-off of the University of Padova. We work on forestry, on ecosystem services, deforestation-free supply chains. So this webinar is a joint effort of 3 EU-funded projects that ETIFOR is a part of. So EMA4U, Go Nature Positive, and the EcoSolve project. And it's been recorded, so it will be made available later on in our platforms. We will explain these projects to you in more detail later today, but I just want to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what are they a little bit. So Go Nature Positive is an initiative dedicated to accelerating awareness and transformative action towards a nature positive economy among policymakers, investors, business, and the wider society. And it's coordinated by the Trinity College Dublin, along with 20 partners across 14 countries. EMA4U is an Erasmus Plus project coordinated by ETIFOR and composed of 10 organizations among universities, business, and NGOs. And within this project, we have been working on the past 3 years on training students and professionals, on sharing knowledge, on deforestation-free supply chains management, and building an alliance of stakeholders. So I'd just like to start with a Slido, just to understand here how many of you are already part of our alliance. So if you can just scan this QR code you see on the screen. I'll give you a few seconds. Thank you. So, of course, if you're not part of the Alliance yet, we welcome you to join us. It's an alliance of stakeholders in the topic of deforestation-free supply chains. And you can easily access it through our website of EMA4U. So while you respond, let me just also start introducing today's topic. Okay, great. A lot of you are already part of the Alliance. That's great. Okay, so while you respond, let's go straight to today's topic. As many of you know, the EU regulatory landscape around sustainability has been evolving quickly in the past years, and there's a good amount of uncertainty on it. But today's webinar, we want to focus on looking beyond compliance. So we'll explore how deforestation-free supply chains driven by regulations like the EUDR can serve as a foundation for broader and nature-positive strategies, and also how companies can build on their compliance investments to create long-term business value. So we have an hour and 15 minutes webinar ahead of us, and it is structured in 2 main parts. So we'll begin with an expert presentation by Timothy Bender, who is a regulatory impact specialist from Preferred by Nature, one of our partners in EMA4U. Tim works on regulatory and policy compliance across forestry, climate, and environmental governance. And today he'll help us unpack the latest developments around the EUDR and guide us through the current EU regulatory landscape. After Tim's presentation, we'll move into a short Q&A session. So please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. Please don't use the chat. so that we can see and pick from your questions afterwards. You'll also be able to view other participants' questions and vote on the ones you'd most like for Tim to answer. This way we can prioritize the most upvoted questions. We will then move into our second session, which is a roundtable discussion moderated by my colleague Colm O'Driscoll. Colm is a strategist at Etifor, leading the development of public funded initiatives, especially in the areas of nature policy, instruments, and nature-based business innovation. We're joined in this discussion by 4 excellent speakers who Colm will introduce more in detail as he brings them along to the discussion. But I would just like to really welcome and warmly thank each of you for being with us today. So we have Samuel Ross from the Zoological Society of London, Paola Delgado Luna from the Accountability Accelerator, Maurice Ryan from Greenbelt, and Lucy Gaffney from Horizon NUA. So thank you all for being here today. The roundtable will last around 25 minutes and it will be followed by another Q&A session. So again, please use the Q&A function to send us your questions and vote for those you wish to see responded. And when writing your question, please write the number of the session that you refer to so that we know who we need to address them to. So if you can also directly address your question to each of the speakers, that would be great as well. So finally, before closing, we will briefly share how EMA4U and Go Nature Positive can continue supporting you, including some tools and training opportunities and ways to stay engaged after today. So let's get started. Timothy, I will hand over to you now. And so I will let you share your screen.
Yes, thank you, Elena. Thank you for the introduction. And bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. There we go. Okay, hello also from my end. I'm very happy to be here to kick off this session today, or this webinar today, with a session on the general policy context around the EUDR and framing deforestation-free supply chains in Europe. I have not a lot of time and quite a lot that I want to cover, so I'm going to get right into it. I want to start with just a brief introduction and reminder of the EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation. I'm sure everyone is already familiar with it, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of the basics. I'll want to talk about a few of the key challenges that companies face when implementing and preparing for the EUDR. I'll further want to summarize the recent changes and amendments that were made to the EUDR. And then after that, I want to move beyond the EUDR and look at a more broader sustainability regulatory landscape. So the EUDR is, of course, one of the, if not the key policy in Europe and honestly also globally, which regulates deforestation. Broadly, the main objectives are to reduce the EU's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss through the reduction of deforestation and forest degradation, but to also increase the consumption of deforestation-free and legally produced products in the EU. The EUDR sets out a specific product scope, a specific list of products which are in scope of the EUDR. These are derived products from key commodities. So we have 6 forestry and agricultural commodities: wood, coffee, cocoa, oil palm, soy, and rubber, and then also live animals, specifically cattle and leather. The key components of the EUDR that I'll be talking about today is one, the prohibition that it sets out for importing and exporting non-compliant products. So that means products that are not deforestation-free and not legally produced, but also the due diligence obligations that it creates for companies. So in the context of the EUDR, when we talk about due diligence, we're talking about the 3 key steps information collection, risk assessment, and risk mitigation. This means, excuse me, that the EUDR requires companies to collect or obtain a set of quite specific and detailed information and data. So this includes notably the precise geolocation information of the plots of land where the relevant product was produced, but also other information like verifiable data or evidence that the products were produced legally and deforestation free. Legally meaning in compliance with the laws in the country of production. And based on all of this information, the company then needs to conduct a risk assessment. For this, the regulation also sets out specific criteria which need to be considered as part of the risk assessment process. This includes, for example, the presence of forests in the area of production. It should include an assessment of the complexity of the supply chain, the data reliability, but also corruption in the country of production. And it also needs to take into consideration indigenous peoples and local communities in the area of production. And then if any risks are identified, these of course need to be mitigated. So this is what we're talking about when we refer to due diligence in the context of the EUDR. Now, all of this has created some very real and practical implementation challenges for companies. And depending on who you ask, you'll get a lot of different answers as to what the biggest challenges are. And I think it does depend a lot on the size of the company, the position in the supply chain, the commodity, the country of production. So it can vary quite a lot, but we do see some challenges reoccur, and I just going to bring them all up on the slide. These are just a few that I picked out of common challenges. I won't have time to speak to all of them, but traceability, for example, is a very commonly quoted challenge. So the company's ability to trace the product that they're selling back to its origin. So where exactly was it produced? Especially if you have a long, complex supply chain, maybe also with a lot of smallholder producers that might also be trading the relevant product or the raw material among each other. That can make it quite challenging for a company to be able to trace their product back. Then now, related to that, we're also seeing that not just obtaining the precise geolocation information, but also having that data in a high quality and accurate state it's becoming quite a challenge for some companies. But of course, also capacity is often a challenge, both for suppliers that might not have the capacity to collect and share all of this information upstream, but also just a European company's capacity that might not have the knowledge or the experience in doing such a risk assessment. They might not necessarily know where to find the information they need, what kind of information the authorities are expecting from them, and just in general how to use the information they have and how to conduct a solid risk assessment. So these are all some challenges that we do see quite a lot. I do want to point to the one right at the bottom of this slide, because I think this is one challenge that probably all companies have been facing, especially last year. So this is the lack of legislative reliability and predictability when it comes to the EUDR. So companies not knowing when it will enter into application, if it will, and what state it will be in when it does. And so for that, we saw towards the end of last year amendments being established for the EUDR, so some key changes. This included another delay in the date of application. There has already previously been another one. So initially the regulation was supposed to start in December 2024. It was postponed to 2025 and now again to 2026. So for large and medium-sized companies, the date of application should be December 2026, and for small and micro operators, June 2027. We additionally also saw some quite significantly reduced obligations for downstream actors. So downstream operators and traders, meaning companies that are in the EU and are buying from importers or from local producers. For these companies, they're no longer required to submit due diligence statements, and their requirement to validate or ensure that their suppliers' due diligence was done correctly has also been reduced quite a lot. Then we also saw some simplifications for smaller primary operators. So a primary operator is a company that is growing, harvesting, or raising a relevant commodity in the case of cattle. Most notably, these companies are no longer required to collect the precise geolocation information for their products. Then another change that was a bit unexpected and kind of came out of nowhere was that printed materials, so for example, books or newspapers, have been completely removed from scope of the EUDR. So basically any products that are listed under Chapter 49 of the Combined Nomenclature, which is a list of all of the different products and their corresponding codes, these have been completely removed from scope. And then lastly, we also have the, as part of the amendments, the provision for a simplification review. So this means that the Commission will conduct a review evaluating if smaller companies need even more simplification and more changes. And the Commission will or is supposed to present a report on this and their findings by the end of April this year. And this may also come with a legislative proposal, so a proposal to change the law again. So that's what we're expecting for the next coming weeks, that the Commission provides this review and this report. Yeah. Now I want to move away from the EUDR. Here we just see a timeline with a non-exhaustive list of due diligence policies in Europe. So we see, of course, the EUDR is not the first and it's not the only one. Just a few that I want to highlight here. We have the forced labor regulation, which, like the EUDR, creates a prohibition for placing non-compliant products on the market. Non-compliant products in this case, meaning products that have been made with forced labor. But we also have policies like the conflict minerals regulation or the battery regulation, which also, like the EUDR, create due diligence obligations for companies. But what I want to focus on here is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. So the CSDDD, one thing that's different compared to the EUDR is that the CSDDD doesn't have a specific commodity scope. So it doesn't focus only on certain commodities or products, but more, it takes a broader approach to due diligence. So companies are required to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence on their supply chains. They're required to identify and distinguish between actual and potential adverse impacts. Potential impacts need to be mitigated or prevented, and actual, so real existing adverse impacts need to be brought to an end or minimized as far as possible. And like the EUDR, the CSDDD also requires companies to really integrate sustainability and due diligence into their operations and into their system. So that means, for example, due diligence needs to be included in companies' policies. They need to establish a complaints procedure, or, for example, they also need to publicly communicate about the due diligence that they are doing. One other distinction I want to make between the CSDDD and the EUDR is that under the EUDR, due diligence focuses on the place of production. So where was the commodity grown and harvested? And that's where we're assessing if deforestation has occurred and illegality. With the CSDDD, it takes a broader approach. So here companies need to consider their entire chain of activities. So that means they need to look at their upstream business partners and all of the different services that these provide, but also the downstream business partners and the different services that they provide. So we just have a broader approach and larger scale, I would say, of due diligence. Then I want to move on just to another group of sustainability policies, the group of sustainability reporting and disclosure laws. Here again, just a short timeline and just a few selected either existing laws or planned policies that mandate sustainability reporting. We, of course, already have quite a lot of voluntary frameworks that look at either financial reporting or sustainability reporting. And we do see some of those being adopted more and more into national policies. But what I want to focus on here is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, which stands out compared to other national attempts to legislate corporate reporting because of its double materiality approach. And what this means is that companies within scope of the CSRD, they need to disclose sustainability information which covers both their impacts on sustainability, meaning their impacts on the environment and society, but also their impacts on the company's financial performance. So here we have this double materiality, the impacts on the environment and society, so sustainability, and financial impacts. And that's just something we don't really see in any other policies so far. And maybe just the last sentence.
Let me just ask you if you can wrap up soon.
Last
so
sentence. Sorry for going over time. Last sentence, just to tie this all back together. We see in the CSRD, of course, it means companies need to collect information, they need to collect data, they need to evaluate that, and they really need to make sustainability considerations part of their operations and internal processes and management. I'll stop there. Sorry for going over time.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Tim. Okay, perfect. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of information to learn from all these regulations. So let's see here. We have a couple of questions on the Q&A. I'll start with the first one. So Dario asks, does the transformation of a tariff code into another code still listed in Annex 1 of the EUDR require the placing of a new product on the market and a new due diligence process? And he asks another question that if so, how can due diligence be conducted on a product without knowing its origin, since the transmission of reference codes stop at the first company downstream from the upstream operator? Can you answer that one, Tim?
Yeah, sorry, I was still muted. So to answer the first question, so yes, the transformation of one relevant product into another is still in scope. So you are considered then a downstream operator, but your obligations have been reduced. So you don't need to do due diligence on that product again. You don't need to submit a due diligence statement. Your obligations are really just limited to collecting information on your buyers and on your suppliers. And the second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I can't remember what it was.
So if so, can due diligence be conducted on a product without knowing its origin, since the transmission reference codes stops at the first company downstream?
Right. Okay. So this is still referring to downstream companies so for downstream operators, they're not required to do due diligence anymore. So of course you can't do due diligence if you don't know where the product comes from, or to an extent, but maybe not as detailed as it needs to be. But if you're downstream, you're no longer required to do due diligence, basically.
Great. So I will just give you one more question and we'll can pass to the next session. So this is a very straightforward question. If companies have to comply with both the EUDR and the CSDDD, do they have to duplicate their due diligence work?
Yeah.
If you can answer to this really quickly.
So no, they don't. This is laid out in the CSDDD text itself. It refers to different policies. For example, the EUDR. It says if you as the company are required to do due diligence by another law, it does not need to be duplicated. So you would then prioritize the one that is more specific. So in the case of the EUDR, if you need to do due diligence for CSDDD and EUDR, you're required to, you have to do it for the EUDR, but you don't need to do another deforestation due diligence for the CSDDD because it acknowledges that you're already doing it for another law, which is more precise than the CSDDD. But that does not exclude you from doing other due diligence in scope of the CSDDD.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim. So
Thank you.
I will pass now to the next session. Let me just share my screen. Okay. You can see the screen. So I will pass now the word to Colin for moderating the second session of the webinar.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thanks to Timothy and thanks to Elena. My name is Colin O'Driscoll and I work as a nature project development strategist in 84. I'd like to continue this discussion with aligning supply chain good practices and nature positive economic models. So opportunities for forestry businesses to go beyond a little bit the compliance that Timothy was focusing on towards value creation, if you like. As we move into session 2 as well, I'd like to highlight that you can share again your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom call, but also here this time if you could put the number 2 in front of your question so we know that it relates to session 2, and then there'll be space to answer these questions at the end. I'll mention this again at the end of this the session just to make sure that it's clear, but please put the number 2 for session 2 at the beginning of your question. And after I introduce the panelists, put the name of the panelist whom you direct the question to as well. Okay, next slide, please. So we've seen essentially here that there's a complex, very complex regulatory framework emerging in the last years. The EU, but also global policy, is reshaping corporate social responsibility and accountability, above all. Companies are, depending on the scope and the role, are required more and more to establish visibility over the origin of materials, for example, ensure traceability across value chain, implement risk-based due diligence processes, as also Timothy was mentioning, and disclose relevant sustainability information. So the key takeaway we could say that was in session 1 was essentially what was leading practice is now a baseline. Regulation is making it a baseline. But we also know that compliance alone doesn't solve the bigger challenge. No? If you could turn to the next slide, please. Thank you. And yeah, what I mean by this is there are a lot of reports emerging, quite important reports from different institutions we may or may not be familiar with that are showing the importance of how nature underpins the wider global economy. But this is undervalued. So the economic system that we operate in is misaligned with nature, no? Financing, there's sort of a financing imbalance related to this as well. That's accelerating biodiversity loss. We see that 50% of global GDP depends on nature. Economic systems, however, still assume infinite resources. This was the outcome of a World Economic Forum, let's say, conference last year in a report that was then produced. And then if you look at this imbalance more in detail, we see that the 7.3 trillion per year harms nature versus the 220 billion for conservation related to nature-based solution projects. Forestry is at the core of this, of course, in terms of nature conservation. And this was one of the important outcomes as well of a recent IPBES report. So at the core of this is that the material economic risk is rising. No, material economic risk related to business, specifically business practices, but also other nature loss could cost 2.5 trillion in the global GDP by 2030. Again, the same report by the World Economic Forum. The corporate response, and here we focus predominantly on the corporate response, remains limited. Less than 1%, and this is incredible, actually, to think that less than 1% of companies report biodiversity impacts, only 9% assess nature-related risks. The policy pressure is increasing, but gaps persist, and we've seen the complexity of this regulation, regulation framework, if you like, where we have to operate. A strategic business imperative. So protecting biodiversity means safeguarding long-term competitiveness, requiring action, skills, and investment. So we must go beyond this baseline a little bit of the regulation, as we know that the current economic system is misaligned with nature. So if you could move to the next slide, please. And again, companies must invest in due diligence. We've seen this now, and with the regulation baseline that Timothy has presented, companies obviously and evidently, given that so few are operating in and responding to this, they're struggling with understanding where to start from. So there are so many tools, frameworks, service providers. There's little knowledge about the application and which is relevant for them, and they have little capacity to actually empower themselves to do things. And very often this results in an externalization of these activities, tools, and services. As a result, they lose the opportunity of translating their data into strategic decisions, which could ultimately end up in business value. So the result here is compliance actually becomes a high cost and not a driver of competitiveness as it could potentially be. And next slide, please. So we need to move a little bit from what has been up to now, this sort of deforestation-free, stopping harm rhetoric to more nature-positive, improving nature over time, ultimately, in our practices. This doesn't necessarily mean that we need to obviously not focus on deforestation, of course. What it means is that we need to start with improving legality in producing countries, and this is what the EUDR is essentially trying to do. And this requires a shift in approach. So we need to focus on starting in identifying impacts and dependencies, prioritizing the hotspots within supply chains, using science-based frameworks that are slightly more flexible, but also support the responding to these the regulatory environment, and building credible and validated actions. I mean, as we've seen previously, setting up strong traceability systems you can actually respond to multiple regulations. This can strengthen the transparency and trust across these systems and enable better sourcing decisions and support long-term resilience and value. So with this, I'd like to frame a little bit the next session, the panel that we're going to introduce now. The framing question we could think about here is a little bit, how do we turn compliance investments into stronger business performance and essentially opportunities as well, and nature-positive outcomes? And next slide, very briefly. As ETIFOR, we are involved in both EMA4EU and Go Nature Positive. We saw the importance of bringing these two important and growing alliances and networks together, both to speak about the importance of responding to the emergent needs of the private sector, but also to show that the more stringent requirements of regulation and what it takes to become nature positive, there are solutions. There are more flexible approaches that can be shared. So once again, very quick reminder, as we move into session 2, please remember the Q&A function and to put in the number of the session 2 first, and then your question, and then the person you'd like to respond to. With this in mind, I'd like to move to now introducing a little bit the first panelist, and who will speak a little bit more about what nature positive means, and specifically nature positive in the private sector, in the forestry sector. So this term nature positive is increasingly used now, but not always clearly defined. Companies need a shared understanding and a practical roadmap. I'd like to introduce Lucy Gaffney, first from Horizon NUA, an expert in biosciences, sustainability, and conservation, and works on helping businesses embed nature-positive strategies in their operations. Lucy will help clarify what nature-positive really means and how companies can start building credible strategies. So I'll ask the first questions to Lucy, and then we'll move on to the other panelists. There'll be space at the end to ask your questions. So please, again, put the questions in the Q&A function. So Lucy, over to you. What do you, in your words, or what does it mean to be, in practice, nature positive in the context of forestry value chains?
Thanks, Colm. Yeah, it's lovely to be here to be able to talk about what nature positive, and I'm really coming from the perspective of an SME. As we know, the forestry sector is full of SMEs and smallholders, so I'm speaking to them directly because that's kind of where my own interest is. But when we think about nature positive and what it means in practice in the context of forestry, we shouldn't really treat it as a sort of a vague aspirational phrase or a marketing phrase. In practical terms, it means that forestry activities are moving simply from reducing harm, which, you know, the deforestation aspect, to an active restoration and improvement of ecosystems in which they're operating. So while they're also maintaining this sort of long-term productivity of forests and the communities that depend on them. So a useful way of thinking about this is in sort of 3 stages. The first one being the avoidance of those nature negative practices. So that kind of really speaks to, you know, preventing deforestation, general forest conservation, especially in high conservation value or primary forests, protecting sensitive habitats that have been identified, like riparian zones and wetlands, reducing the pollution and soil degradation associated with forestry activities, preventing invasive species, and maintaining water quality. So, you know, they're the sort of nature negative practices that we're trying to avoid. But we then need to couple that with the improvement of forest management across the value chain. So, you know, it's not just one activity, you know, in terms of reducing nature negative. We also need to stack that with improvement in forest management. So, you know, that's really about increasing species diversity, maintaining structural diversity in the wood, so leaving dead wood and varied age classes and canopy layers and things like that within the management system, and using continuous cover forestry or selective harvesting where possible. And the third piece of that puzzle is about creating gains, net gains for nature. So this is really the defining feature of nature positive, is that business is actively contributing to measurable improvements in nature. So this might include stuff like restoration of degraded forests or indeed peatlands, you know, if it's extending into a peatland or wetland, expanding native woodland cover, reintroducing missing ecological functions, again, mention of leaving dead wood there and allowing natural regeneration to happen. So, you know, there's a number of ways that a forestry business can create those gains for nature. And I suppose the fourth sort of umbrella action or umbrella point that I want to make is that nature is brought into decision making. And that's the key part, I think, that's missing in a lot of these conversations, is a lot of businesses get stuck in terms of how do we integrate nature into everyday strategic business decision making. And part of that hinges on the fact that nature is recognized as a business risk, and that it appears on risk registers and it appears in risk mitigation strategies. So that's a piece that's often missing. Those dots need to be connected, and those conversations need to be enhanced around the actual strategic side.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. That really resonates. It sounds complicated, and it leads into my next question, which is a little bit like, well, okay, we have this term which seems sort of very motivating and interesting at face value, but how does a nature positive supply chain differ from one that is just deforestation free?
Well, I think if we are thinking about a nature positive, like when we think about deforestation, we're only really looking at one environmental harm. And, you know, nature positive is much more detailed than just one single harm and one single perspective, if you like. So the conversion of natural forest to other land uses, that's essentially what deforestation is. And we in order to be more nature positive, we need to look at how the aims are to ensure that business activities are contributing to recovery and improvement. So, you know, there's quite a difference in terms of the single view of a deforestation supply chain. Nature positive takes that a whole step further in terms of, you know, that active participation in the recovery of ecosystems beyond what they're doing in their day-to-day business.
Great. No, thank you. And again, it sounds a little bit more complicated when you start to unpack it. What's the first step in your opinion a company should take to move from general commitments that were sort of mentioned loosely before to a credible nature strategy?
The first one, and it feels like a drum I've been banging for years, is helping businesses to understand what their impacts and dependencies are on nature. That's a really key step. And that can be really challenging for a lot of people. Now, I suppose in a forestry supply chain or in a forestry business, you're sitting in an industry that is very connected to nature, and certainly the impacts and dependencies are surface quite readily versus an organization that might be sitting further into that value chain. So I suppose for a forestry business, it may not be as much of a challenge to really understand that connection with nature and to understand the risks associated with nature loss. But that's the first step, is really mapping and understanding what those impacts and dependencies are. And then the next stage, and this will tie into things like TNFD and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and their LEAP approach and various other approaches that help businesses, those tools that exist to help businesses. But it points to that location. So locating and identifying priority locations and where the high impact areas are, and understanding what your impact is, whether it's direct impact or it's upstream impact as well. So they're the kind of two key things that a business can start doing in order to start building that picture for themselves.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And this leads in actually to sort of the practical implementation and what the forest companies are actually doing into the next speaker. So how policy and frameworks only matter, I guess, if they can be implemented in real business contexts. So two questions that emerge there are what can companies actually do and what have they been doing in the forestry sector? And with this, I'd like to introduce Maurice Ryan, who's the Director of Business from Greenbelt, a full-service forestry management firm operating across Ireland and one of the largest in the country for private foresters. So Maurice will share some practical insights from forestry operations, including traceability and biodiversity-focused management. So Maurice, the first question for you is, how does your company's sustainability practices align with the broader strategy towards a nature-positive economy?
Thanks, Colin. Well, obviously, as a forestry company, we're regulated by the Department of Agriculture here in Ireland, and the rules and implementations that are directed from Europe. So, you know, for over 40 years, we've been working within those guidelines. So, any forestry operation requires a license, and within that license process, there's quite a detailed assessment and analysis of the land. And more recently, I would say sort of the last 15 years particularly, there's been a greater emphasis on nature and protecting nature, and particularly watercourses, improving biodiversity in species, and obviously tracking and tracing timber and timber movements. There's also obviously a legislative obligation within Ireland on forestry operations to replant post-harvesting. And that's been very strictly enforced by the department, and again, specifically in more recent times. But you know, there is that great risk as the Irish forestry profile gets closer to sort of peak timber, if you want to use that term, where we're going to start seeing an awful lot of the forestry that was planted at its peak planting times, which was mid-90s, mature over the next 5 to 10 years. That there is a great risk of deforestation potentially in the country if that reforestation obligation isn't enforced.
Great, thank you. No, and this leads into sort of the next question, which is more focusing on challenges, some of which were brought up as well by Timothy before. Yeah. I'm just wondering here in this case, in this context, practically, what is the most challenging, even technically and operationally, for you? So the greatest challenges related to sort of the rollout and the uptake of nature positive strategies and broader sustainability strategies.
Yeah, and it is a really good question, because we're seeing a shift in that. And when CSRD and other metrics were sort of very high on the agenda, there was a greater emphasis towards achieving, I suppose, having nature-based solution within a portfolio of solutions for a business. And I think it is, when you look at the impact on nature, and it was mentioned in the previous discussion, like the lack or the gap in funding towards these projects that need to be led by probably corporates. And unfortunately, there isn't a greater enough stick to drive corporates into this space. And the carrot probably isn't attractive enough either. With that, I mean, there's no punishment if you don't have greater visibility on your supply chain necessarily, or your impact on nature and addressing that impact on nature. And on the other side of it, there's not enough drive from other companies within your value chain looking for that nature-based activity that you've completed. We've worked with a few companies who have been, I suppose, if you want to call them pioneers. I hope they don't become martyrs, but they become pioneers in delivering nature-based projects. They're projects that are, and Lucy mentioned this, is even just looking at forestry and taking a different angle on it, is looking at a reforestation project, introducing more diverse species, allowing more natural regeneration occur, and looking at it not just from a commercial return perspective, but looking at timber production from many results and many concepts. So looking at biodiversity gain, habitat improvement, water quality enhancement, and amenity value, just to mention a few. And businesses have seen a real impact internally within their own business on introducing these projects. You know, the biggest hurdle here, and you asked about that specifically, and I'll focus on that rather than running on a rant, but the biggest hurdle is actually getting a commitment, financial commitment from the business. You may have a sustainability champion within the business who would like to see this happen, and you may even have members of the C-suite who would like to see this happen. But the problem is they're answerable to shareholders and stakeholders, and if it doesn't deliver a direct line in return and financial return, very typically they're taken off the agenda, and particularly when things are challenging as they are now with fuel prices, for example. You know.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if I can understand as well, between the lines of what you're saying, somewhat is the absence of a determined framework that supports and facilitates this. And this kind of leads into the next panelist. So, I mean, if we see this need for recognized, determined framework that can also support and somehow facilitate value creation, but businesses are not aware of it, I think it's critical to engage at a wider scale these kinds of frameworks to the businesses and the companies who are interested at least, but again unaware, maybe low on capacity, and are navigating sort of in this cloud of requirements, if you like. So many companies recognize their activities' impacts on nature. This is evident, I think, also from what you're saying, want to act, but struggle to know where to start and ensure their efforts are credible and meaningful. With this, I'd like to pass to the next speaker. So Paula Delgado Luna from the Accountability Accelerator, who leads the validation of the science-based targets for nature, a framework that somehow we could say responds a little bit to this lack of determined framework that was mentioned, and facilitates a little bit the sustainability and accountability in business practices. She leads the validation of science-based targets for nature and brings deep expertise in environmental consulting and auditing, corporate accountability and sustainability frameworks. Paula will help us understand a little bit how to move from ambition, if you like, to real accountability. So Paula, for you, the first question that I have here is, where should forestry companies start if they want to tackle their impacts on nature in a structured and credible way?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Colm. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, I mean, I think a lot has been said already by my colleagues that preceded me, but for sure I will repeat it again because forestry companies and any other company really has to start by understanding their impacts and dependencies on nature, right? So if a company wants to be here the next 20 to 30 years and be successful, they need to start understanding those impacts. And in particular, I mean, the forestry sector has a huge role to play in our society for global food security and ecosystem services if we're going to feed the world of 9 billion people in this planet, right, by 2050. So definitely we have to stop deforestation. And, you know, I think you have seen these stats before, but really our unsustainable practices, farming practices, have uh, 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 contributed to deforestation of about 80% of deforestation worldwide, and also 70% of land biodiversity loss. So that's huge. That's huge. So all of these topics, sustainability topics, are interrelated. And that's where I think some of these voluntary frameworks come in, and they try to help companies make sense of this information and these connections. Because, of course, companies have to report now to regulatory frameworks like CSRD and others in other countries, but they also are using other tools and standards to help them through this process, go through this process in a very structured way. So, in reality, the regulatory framework and the standards and tools are there for helping companies understand where to start, right? It's a compass of where to start and how to start. And that's exactly what the SBTN has tried to do. So SBTN stands for Science Based Target Network. They're an organization of more than 90 plus partners, and they have developed these methodologies for credible, robust targets that are grounded on science and that will help us stay within the Earth limits or the planetary boundaries. That's basically a natural next step for companies that are first understanding and reporting their impacts on nature. Then it's okay, let's start acting, let's set targets, and let's integrate it into our strategies. And that's basically what SBTN has developed, a five-step methodologies. The first one is to understand materiality in your company and prioritize locations to set targets. And then in step 3, companies then have to set targets for freshwater, land, or oceans, depending on where they have material impacts. Step 4 is to act to achieve these targets. And step 5 is to report and measure progress over time, right? So I would just close this by saying, like this first question, by saying that forestry is quite important in the SBTM framework because pulp, cellulosics, cardboard, and basically all products derived from timber and round wood are a high impact commodity under the SBTM framework and a conversion driving commodity for land. So if you as a company have these commodities in your director operations or your supply chain, then you have to include it in your targets.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. No, that's super clear. And I'm just wondering from this as well, considering some of the regulations that we've mentioned, which many companies at the moment are kind of mobilizing around, if you like, how companies can align these compliance efforts. So at the beginning, if you like, as you mentioned, as a stepping stone towards a broader nature strategy, thinking as well about the work that SBTN is doing.
Yes, I mean, really, the disclosure on ESG and due diligence, it's a decision-making tool, right? And companies are trying to make sense of the data and also the lack of data that they have. And they are really trying to use these tools and standards to organize their plan and their strategies. And what I've seen is that many companies are using, for example, SBTN methodologies to report on their materiality and justify their materiality as well as their plans to these regulatory frameworks like CSRD. But they're also using it for other voluntary frameworks like TNFD, the World Benchmark Alliance, B Corp, and others. So it is a very powerful tool. And the reason is because companies are realizing that SBTN methods help them translate sometimes very complex science into very measurable, actionable, and verifiable KPIs, right, for their businesses. So that's really, really strong value. They're also helping companies to go beyond regulatory compliance. So, for example, in the land method of SBTN, companies must go beyond deforestation to also cover the conversion of other natural ecosystems that are also very important, like grasslands and wetlands. So it goes beyond what is covered in the EUDR. Also, in terms of commodities, so as already presented by Timothy, there are 7 main commodities in EUDR. In SBTN, the list goes farther to include all other global traded commodities. So it's helping them increase and increase their scope and make a very robust strategy, and also is helping them put a number on their investments, right? So if we know we have to achieve these thresholds, how do we get there? And that is very valuable for businesses.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, I wanted to speak a little bit more of this. I'm conscious of the time as well. So just very briefly, we might close with what tangible benefits do companies gain from following a science-based and validated approach?
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning the part of validated. I think that's where the Accountability Accelerator comes in. So we are the validation arm of SBTN. So we are an independent organization, and we work with our expert consultants. ETFOR is one of them, and we have an independent integrity council to help review these targets. And really, that's one of the main benefits of validating science-based targets for nature, that the claims that companies can make are credible and they inspire trust, right? So they help with their investors' relationships with other stakeholders like customers and employees. They improve reputation. They help companies standardize the way that they integrate nature into their strategies. They raise ambition on previously set commitments, right? They help pave the work for other frameworks because of the very thorough data collection and data analysis that they have to do with SBTN methods. But I would say specifically also it allows companies to make claims about their contribution to global frameworks, like, for example, the Paris Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the UN Convention to combat desertification, etc. So yeah, we are lucky that we had also recent announcements from companies like Novo Nordisk, URW, and H&M, and all of these companies are realizing these benefits and making public claims.
Thank you, Paula. And again, once again, this actually leads in well to the next speaker. So again, here speaking about validation, responsibility in supply chains in order to comply with the EUDR, but also very much in line with some of these other frameworks and the regulations, of course. We need to be able to have a certain confidence about where we're sourcing materials from. And the more confidence we have, the easier it is, I suppose, for us to respond to the regulations, but also align with these frameworks, specifically where you source your raw materials from. So one interesting innovation that's emerging is now with our last speaker panelist, so Samuel Ross. And like Samuel Ross, now I'd like to pass to you. Samuel Ross is a sustainable business advisor from the Zoological Society of London, working on timber supply chains and capacity building for due diligence and biodiversity management across the Congo Basin. Sam's going to introduce to us an innovation, a scientific timber testing as a tool to strengthen supply chains traceability. And as I said, again, build that confidence that's needed in order to respond to sourcing requirements. Okay, so Sam, my first question to you is, how can scientific testing strengthen accountability in forestry supply chains?
Thanks, Colm, and I'll try and keep it brief as I'm aware of the time.
Thank you.
I guess very quickly, when we're talking about scientific testing, at least in my case, we're talking about tools that help you to verify the origin of wood products rather than those that help you identify species. I'm talking in the context of a project funded by the EU EcoSolve program to build capacity for origin testing by expanding World Forest ID's reference library for key African timber species. Back to the question, I think that in essence, really, chemical testing helps strengthen accountability by providing independent scientific proof that the true origin of the product you're sourcing is actually consistent with what the supplier has claimed, and that ultimately gives you confidence that your due diligence is accurate and that you're effectively managing supply chain risk. As Timothy was talking about the EUDR earlier, the EUDR, and similar regulations like the UKTR don't mandate the use of testing, but it does help companies meet their due diligence requirements, particularly looking at risk mitigation, verifying geolocation data, and addressing the risk of mixing. And we know from online reports that competent authorities are already using testing as part of their enforcement activities. So we know that it's being used in enforcement, then there's a good sort of incentive for companies to be using the same tools as well.
Great. Just thinking about how we go beyond that a little bit, so beyond the regulatory compliance, how can origin verification that you've explained a little bit inform better sourcing decisions and contribute to, again, what we're speaking about here is a broader nature positive perspective and strategy?
Yeah, I think there's a link with some of the kind of focus of SBTN there as well. I think the focus is on compliance, and it was developed as a compliance tool, but it's still very much voluntary at this stage, and it's only being used by a minority of companies. If we look at beyond compliance, it gives companies a greater certainty about their sourcing decisions and their supply chain monitoring by verifying that the location listed on your supplier's documents is actually the location that the timber has been harvested in. It means that when you're doing things like satellite analysis, field visits to monitor and check for deforestation, you're doing it on concessions that are actually the ones you're sourcing from, and not another concession down the road or whatever. I think in a kind of wider landscape context, it can help companies to continue supporting and sourcing from responsible suppliers that may be based in regions like the Congo Basin that are seen as high risk, but are arguably the most important when it comes to supporting responsible forestry companies and showing a kind of proof that responsible forestry can be rewarded.
Okay, and what about the relationship? So the relationship who I guess suppliers and buyers may have quite a traditional mindset, also given the forestry sector as well. Does this kind of testing change relationships between suppliers and buyers?
Yeah, I mean, it's always great to hear from forestry companies themselves in their own experiences on this, but I think in the case of our work, which is focused on the Congo Basin, there's definitely a positive impact in it, and that it is seen as an opportunity for some of the companies there. As part of our work there, we collected samples in concessions in Cameroon, and many of the companies that we visited were kind of supportive and receptive to the idea of increasing testing capacity, as it sort of gives them an access or continued access to markets like the EU and the UK, and ensures that, as I said earlier, that responsible companies are rewarded and not penalized for the reputation of less compliant counterparts in the surrounding areas and so on. And I think, yeah, very briefly, just in terms of relationships between individual suppliers, I think this is likely to vary a lot. I think that even if you don't test very regularly as a buyer, you're still having an impact on your supply chain with the knowledge that you might be testing, whether that has a negative or positive influence.
Yeah, and also getting informed and knowing what's coming, I suppose, as well. What about barriers? So what barriers, and then I'll pass to the Q&A. So what barriers still exist for mainstream adoption of this? I mean, where are you in this process? Because it sounds super interesting. I mean, just to understand a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so there's lots of barriers that come up, or sort of perceived barriers. I think, again, World Forest ID put out a survey recently to companies to kind of assess their use of testing and understand why some companies use it and others don't. So it'd be interesting to see that when the results come out. I know from speaking to some importers in the UK that cost is still a factor. It's still sort of seen as too expensive to do regularly. Prices have come down to around £300 to £400 per test in my experience, but it's still a bit of a limiting factor. The main barriers that we're sort of focused on is one, the lack of awareness, and two, the lack of adequate reference data, which is sort of the kind of headline hurdle that needs to be addressed in the testing world. I think without comprehensive reference data, essentially you can't verify the claimed origin. And ideally you want reference data for every country that a species grows. Doing that is expensive, it's time consuming, and it's a bit of a logistical challenge. Our project is focused very much on a key set of species, key set of commercial species in Cameroon and the Congo Basin, and really trying to get good coverage for that target species in a target area. And I think more broadly, as a last point, it's something that World Forest ID is really helping to address by creating standardized methods for collecting and analyzing samples, because I think in the past there's been a problem where you've got lots of organizations and private companies that offer testing with incoherent and sort of limited reference databases. So that limits really the effectiveness of this as a tool. If you have a kind of centralized, comprehensive database that everyone can add to, then it's really much more beneficial to scaling this quickly.
Thank you, Sam. And just very quickly, I'm conscious of the time, but to tie that back into Paula's, let's say, introduction of the SBTN, I mean, how does something like this tie into SBTN? Can such an innovation, this single origin verification, strengthen the credibility of science-based targets? Where does it fit?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on SBTN. I know Paolo will know a lot more, but having had a little look, I think the sort of obvious example is the land target on zero conversion of natural ecosystems, or no conversion of natural ecosystems, particularly looking at upstream supply chains. So sort of, as I said earlier, it provides an added layer of verification to things like satellite analysis or other due diligence activities you're doing, that in the case of an SBTN target and the no conversion one, that the sourcing area you're using for your target and you're monitoring is actually the area that you're sourcing from. So it I guess gives you a more accurate reflection of your target, or at least reduces the risk that you might be, I don't know, sourcing from another location that is actually being deforested and is not being captured by your monitoring because it's being laundered or mixed in the supply chain somewhere.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sam. And thanks to all the panelists. I'm very conscious of the time. And I would like to move on to the Q&A. So I'm just going to open the Q&A session and see if there are questions. I see one question, two questions, but I don't see who they're directed towards. For session 2, the first question that I see is, what are relations, alignment, and consistency between SBTN targets and IPBES methodological assessment of the impact and dependency of business on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people? Should not assessment be conducted before target setting? I might pass this to, as there isn't a name, either Lucy or Paula. Lucy, do you want to have a go at this one?
I think Paula might be better because she's got the SBTN expertise.
SBTN,
so
yeah.
Sorry,
Please,
Paula.
Yes, happy to answer. Great question. Thanks, Colin, Lucy. Well, I would say for sure that's the first step, that companies have to understand where their impacts are and where basically their intervention will create the maximum benefit, right? So that's actually step 1 and step 2 in SBTN 5-step framework. And that's before they set targets. So in those steps is where companies introduce mainly the indicators that they are using as well for other frameworks on, pressure estimates, on water consumption, water pollution, waste, land use change, etc. So they look at all of these indicators, but they also try to understand where these impacts are occurring, and they're trying to assess the state of nature in those places, right? So that's a very thorough analysis that leads to a ranking, an environmental ranking of those locations, to then understand where a company could start setting targets. And on top of this environmental ranking, the companies also do an additional analysis based on strategic interests, also contribution, nature contribution to people, and dependencies, to then help inform where the company will start, right? But this is a journey, and basically SBTN is saying, okay, look, this assessment is your first step, but then starting to act, you may choose the first top priority basins, for example, on freshwater, and then continue over time increasing the boundary as you move on. The most important thing is to get started to act.
Okay, no, thank you, Paula. I might ask, actually, there's another question there related to SBTN, but I might ask the person who posed the question to follow up with Paula, maybe, if that's okay, Paula. And I might jump to the other question, and then we'll close the Q&A, which I think is for Sam. It's a little bit more specific, Sam, but I think it's quite relevant. Session 2 for Sam. So from Ben. Could you go into a little bit the pricing of testing and how realistic is this to be done on a regular basis, e.g., for example, at ports by customs agents?
Yeah, I think my perspective on this comes from our research, and with that, it came to around £300 to £400 per sample. I think in the case of companies, it's certainly not used regularly. From what I understand, it's used when you've got a high risk supply chain or potentially a new supplier or a particularly risky product. So it's very much a targeted tool. The costs do add up with everything, and I know that the cost applies with enforcement agencies as well. In the UK, the OPSS just agreed a partnership last year with a private testing company. So that's one way that enforcement authorities are approaching it, to have a partnership with the testing providers to reduce the cost and sort of allow for more tests to be done. World Forest ID have also developed an evaluation platform, which is on a membership basis, I believe. And that, again, is designed to reduce the cost. So you still need to get the samples tested by a lab, but you can then upload the sort of raw data into their platform, and it will produce a easily understandable version. But yeah, it is still very costly, particularly when you take into account all the work that goes into collecting the samples. That's hopefully something that we can work to reduce.
Great. Yeah, no, I really hope, because it's very interesting, and maybe able to doing cost benefit of sort of the regulatory environment, what's necessary maybe to roll out of such a tool. Maybe the cost might come down in the future. Okay, I'm really conscious of the time, so we're going to move to the last part. And this is, again, if you could change the next slide. So we're going to move on to a short presentation of the two projects, just so everyone is familiar with let's say, the broader environment of why we're here today. So I'd like to introduce first of Go Nature Positive project. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And the reason why we brought these two projects together is a lot of the discussion topics today are very much relevant to our different audiences. So we're trying to bring the solutions, specifically focusing on the forestry sector in this particular case, but obviously this has wider influences on the broader nature positive economy, as we've seen today. So the goal of Go Nature Positive is accelerate the awareness and transformative action towards a nature positive economy, with sort of a broadly speaking, about this 4-year project. It's a three stage or phase approach, if you like. You can see here the first phase is really navigating a little bit the concepts. There's a lot of jargon out there, as you've seen, even the regulatory environment, a lot of jargon that exists, a lot of frameworks. So we're trying to unravel that a little bit, create clear concepts, and moving into sort of defining what the nature positive economy means, and then ultimately clarifying this concept and aligning it with policy, practice, and indicators, setting roadmaps and blueprints as well as we go along for different sectors. If you could move to the next slide, please. Within the project, we have 6 pilots, and at ETI4, we are coordinating, let's say, the pilots of this project. And what that means is sort of aligning and supporting the interaction between these different pilot sectors. And one of these is ETI4, but there's also tourism, agriculture, apiculture, blue economy, and green buildings. And again, today's discussion's been centered a little bit more around forestry, but it's all relevant for what regards the nature positive economy. If you could move for, again, maybe those of who are, and I would say it seems to be the dominant number of participants related to the forestry sector. Again, here, just for information, there's a lot going on in the project. We're going to have, you can see the outputs. There's going to be an assessment of impacts, a roadmap for forestry sector, and awareness and demonstration of methods and capacity building. And this will result in sector guidance and implementing nature positive through insetting, but also increased knowledge and awareness on impacts on nature. So stay involved, stay tuned. And with that, I'd like to just ask those who are left, the last slide, please, from Go Nature Positive project, before handing to Emma for EU, please have a look at our survey. We're launching this survey. If you could just maybe take some time, it would be great for us. We're trying to, as I mentioned, define a little bit what it means to be nature positive, but also nature positive economy, and understand and explore what the potential market for nature positive in this project. And so to do that, we need to understand with practitioners, predominantly in this case, the private sector. So whether you're an NB, an SME, or a business, a large-scale corporate, if you could please take some time you can zoom in on the QR code there, take some time, 15 to 20 minutes, and fill out our survey. That would be great. It will help us define better, let's say, the tools that will emerge from this project, and align them, and then also provide as well the better capacity and more targeted capacity building and knowledge exchange activities, which anyone attending today would be more than happy to follow up and have you join our wider network as well. So have your say, take the survey, please. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Elena. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Colm. I'll be brief as well to present here before closing, just some final indications of what we have coming up in EMA4U as well. So first of all, I would just like to invite you again to join our alliance of stakeholders. So if you go into our platform, our website, you can see here on the join button how to register in this alliance. It is a common platform for exchanging knowledge and opportunities among the stakeholders. So there are news about relevant events coming up. There are jobs and opportunities, jobs and internship opportunities. There's a space for all members to share knowledge or what they're working on, or even some pressing questions. So I suggest many of you who wrote to us the questions that we weren't able to respond, you can also share them with us in this knowledge sharing section of the platform. So on the train section of our website, you can also find our final training activities. So we've already delivered several in-presence and online trainings for students and professionals. And right now we have ongoing our MOOC, so an online self-paced course in English. The course has started in December, but you can start whenever. So far, it's going to close on the 12th of May. So I suggest all of you that are interested to register as soon as possible. There's still quite some time. There are two possible tracks for the course. One is the free version. So all the basic content, so all the core of the contents of the course we delivered, we put together of this program among the 10 organizations that are part of our consortium. This is free of charge. So the first 5 modules. There's also the option to take the verified track. The verified track, the difference is that participants will gain access to 2 complementary modules. I'll explain a little bit now. And participants that do the verified track will receive a digital certificate from Wageningen University after completing the course, and they will have their materials graded. So also just to note that students or whoever is officially enrolled in any of the EMA4U university partner institutions have free access also to the verified course. So just drop us a message and we can change if that's the case for you. Here, just very briefly, to outline a little bit of what the course contents are. So the first 3 modules are really an introduction, giving the basis, setting the baseline of EUDR, what are the basic requirements and obligations. There's also a module focused on voluntary schemes, so certifications and CSR. We have 2 modules, very technical. So we have several tools, several frameworks. Some of them were also the ones that were presented here. So, for example, we have a lesson specific about scientific testing, very related to what Sam presented. There is a lesson about SBTN and many others, also about the use of geolocation information and so on. The last 2 models are these models that are closed only for the verified track. One of them is very much focused on management and soft skills. And the final one is basically developing a report, a project that will be evaluated by the Wageningen experts. Finally, just to give you a glimpse of, we have many materials also available online that we have been developing and building, putting together on the last 3 years. So there are several reports for different publics and with different levels of depth in the contents as well. We have several videos also presenting many case studies in the area of deforestation-free supply chains and EUDR and so on. So I invite you all to go and have a look in our websites and explore these materials, and also to subscribe to the newsletter so that you will be made aware whenever there is anything else coming up. And that is it from our side. So also, just before closing, I'd like to emphasize that these initiatives are very much built on the collaboration, co-creation between all stakeholders. So we really invite you to stay engaged with us and with all the partners and the speakers that presented today, and share your experiences, your questions. Really, you can reach out and to all of us. What we discussed today was really just a glimpse of the really in-depth work that all the speakers develop behind these projects. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.